But when you, from an economist's point of view, are we in a situation in London, possibly globally, where what's happened is that the financialisation of everything, tertiary industries, banking, accounting, etc., have become primary industries and driven out actual wealth creators, or people can come up with the next brilliant thing, which is ultimately a wealth generator?
Yeah, I mean, the finance sector, England and London in particular, has been dominated by the finance sector since the Big Bang, when Margaret Thatcher was running the country. And it was seen as a way of building an industry which could generate large revenue, and we could make up for a decline in manufacturing by exporting services instead. What they actually did was triple the level of private debt. That's where the wealth came from. And what you had is that when you triple that level of debt, first of all, the growth of debt gives you a stimulus to the economy, because when you borrow money and spend it, you actually boost both expenditure and incomes. But ultimately, that becomes a complete burden on people. They can't afford it anymore. It all turns up in inflated asset prices, and then the whole thing comes crashing down. And England will be about the 10th country in the OECD that's gone through this process, not having learnt from the previous 9, and the next 6 or 7 are going to follow them, and they're doing exactly the same thing. So it's one of these things that works on the way up and comes crashing on the way down, and it ends up, as you're saying, it ends up draining you of not just of your creative workers, it drains you of your ordinary unskilled workers as well. They can't afford to deliver the services that the wealthy people who've been made wealthy by the leverage actually want.
If 2 doctors on doctors' salaries can't afford a place to live, where do nurses and teachers and social workers and cleaners live?
This property owning democracy idea, this idea of linking houses
to democracy.
The Germans, when we talk about Berlin and the brain drain going to Berlin, the Germans have never fallen for this idea of a proper...
The most remarkable thing for me about Germany as a real estate world, opposed to England and Australia and Canada and so on, is that the rights you have as a tenant in Anglo-Saxon countries are dreadful. You get a 6-month lease, maybe a 1-year lease. After that, you can be given 4 weeks' notice and you're out the door. That's the total rights you have. In Germany, when you take out a rental contract in renting a German property, you are expected to deliver the kitchen. I don't mean the knives and forks and the cutlery. I mean the entire kitchen, the stove, the works. The previous tenant takes theirs out with them. People normally stay 15 years in a property of that order. They know that they're going to get the benefit for any investment they put into the quality of the place themselves. They don't need to own to make it their place, and therefore there isn't that pressure to get out from a lousy landlord, and therefore also there isn't this whole idea of landlords making money by capital gain.
Incredibly corrosive, isn't it?
Rather than getting a democracy out of it, you get an oligarchy, and they work. For a while, people think they're getting wealthier, and some people are. But
the wealth effect.
The wealth effects, What's actually happening is the only real people who make a living out of this are the wolves of Wall Street types. But individuals in general don't end up being any wealthier. Finance people buying houses. And what you get is this increasing debt, drives up house prices, encourages more into the same old circle, and what you get is a driving up of house prices relative to incomes, which works until such time as it exhausts the supply of people who are capable or willing to take on this huge level of debt compared to their incomes. A fraction of the population that has a mortgage below the age of 30 is 9 times lower than it was 30 years ago. That's meaning that you've got to be, originally you've got to get a mortgage when you're 20, then 25, then 30, then 35. The demographics are saying ultimately nobody can afford to take on that new mortgage. And that's when the whole, not property ladder, but property elevator collapses. A
neoclassical economist or neoliberal economist, when they're modelling the economy, they don't factor banks' debt or money into any of their models. Did you know that?
It is horrifying.
It's flabbergasting at the same time.
Utterly shocking.
People think economists must be experts on money. But what they've done is they built an excuse in their mental framework to say money doesn't matter, so we can model the economy without modelling money or banks or debt. And then what's happened in the meantime, money and banks and debt have driven the entire economy into an impossible situation. And that's why they didn't see the financial crisis coming, when it was bleedingly obvious when you look at the data. The data they ignore is credit.
You did see it coming.
Yeah.
You've been criticised and praised in equal measure, or probably not equal measure, but you've taken a fair old kicking for it because, you know...
That's why I wear a leather jacket. It makes me slightly tougher.
Teflon keen. Are you here with a few other predictions? Because you're looking at other countries now.
Yeah.
And we'd like to know your thinking about who next to fall over.
Okay, there are identified between 9 and 17 countries that have managed to avoid the financial crisis back in 2008 by borrowing their way out of it.
Right.
Okay, which just means basically when you jump off the cliff, it's going to be a higher cliff. And the most obvious one of those is China. China has one way out, that China is such a mix of a private and public system that they can slip over from private bubbles to public ones with the drop of a hat, or a drop of a commissar's hat, of course. But Canada, Australia, Sweden, which I didn't necessarily expect to see there, Belgium, actually almost one of the top of the list ones, where they've leveraged their way out of the crisis back in 2008. Norway's there as well. So a range of countries, some you would expect, South Korea, another one. So that between 9 and 17 countries have got out of the crisis in 2008 by borrowing more, appeared to avoid the crisis, but of course their crunch is coming when their rate of growth of private debt slows down. And that's starting to happen in several of those countries, including Canada right now, and Australia's on the precipice as well. So they are going to finally join what I call the walking dead of debt, which are countries like America, Spain, Portugal, England, which all had debt bubbles. They burst, and now they're in the aftermath where demand from credit is low, and what the authorities are trying to do is restart it from an impossibly high level of private debt already.
I'm going to make you Chancellor of the UK for a day, and here's your culture minister. What we need to do is get entrepreneurship, the creative industries, the wealth-creating industries, as we see it, moving again. How do you do it?
Well, I'm in favour of what I call a modern debt jubilee, which is simply saying we created too much private debt. We have to cancel it somehow, but we can't do that just by writing off debt as used to happen in ancient jubilees, because that benefits the people who speculated and doesn't benefit those who didn't speculate, people who tried to be savers rather than leveragers. So if you use the government's capacity to create money, give money to people on a per capita basis, level playing field effect. If you're in debt, your debt level get reduced. If you're not in debt, you get a cash injection. So you don't have the moral hazard of actually rewarding people for speculating previously. That could be done, and I'd like to do it in small trial doses as well, rather than on the scale that's actually necessary to bring us back to pre-bubble levels of debt. But once we've done that, that would drive asset prices down as well. Now, if you get back to the level where the leverage is back to what it was, which England managed to do fairly well for a century, below 75% of GDP, you will drive the house prices down as well. And we've got to stop banks profiting from driving up our house prices, which is how they profit right now. Well, again, this comes back to what the Germans do, and they have a policy which makes it possible for people to rent without paying an overwhelming proportion of their income to do so. Now, what we've done, of course, we've got rid of the social housing, which let the private sector be parasitical on how they develop it. A combination of the two is the best way to go about it. You have social housing, you provide a level that means people aren't driven by desperation into debt to buy a property, but you also have the private construction as well. And what you try to do is get housing, the building of new housing, to cost no more than about 3 years' income. Whereas at the moment, want to buy a new house in London, the sheer cost of the land means that might be 10 times income. We spend all our time building houses rather than building factories.
Yeah.
And what you want, if you have a vibrant economy, you want to have more ways of making stuff, not more ways of sleeping overnight. And we falsely believe that we can get wealthy by selling second-hand houses to each other, or that producing more houses actually makes a more vibrant economy. This is where the Germans are better off again. Their credit system, generally speaking, provides money for factories to produce things to sell the rest of the world, not to drive up the price of houses we go back and sleep in overnight.
Let me, as we conclude, let me come to you, Rebecca, for a final thought on how we get out of this precarious conundrum that is the global but concentrated London housing crisis.
I think economic policy is something that's really difficult for the average person to engage with, and the more that there are opportunities for people to look around and have a little bit of the recipe for, or the formulations that underlie the logic that underlies the changes to the city that they're seeing around them, the more that they could perhaps engage actively with those changes.
I would tame the beast of finance. This has all been driven by increasing leverage, and it's happened because banks can pretend to lend to you based on your income, but they continue changing the ratio. So if you go back to the 1960s, you had to have 30% of the deposit to buy a property. Now, of course, you've had situations where banks are saying, we'll lend you 120%. Why is it amazing to anybody that's driven house prices up? Okay. Now, the trouble is when we compete over a house right now, if I was fighting with you for a house and we're both on the same income, the one of us who would win would be the one who got the high level of leverage. Okay. If we had a limit that says banks can only lend, say, 10 times the rental income, the property you and I are both trying to buy, we couldn't get any more money, borrowed money than each other. The way to win would be to save more money. That would remove the engine that makes us want to go to the banks to borrow the money in the first place. That's the main thing I'd bring back in to try to bring that level down over time to force house prices down, because expensive houses don't make a wealthy society, they impoverish it.
And on that note, Steve Keane, Rebecca Ross, thank you both very much for your time. That's it from Renegade Inc. HQ this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, and you can join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.